We're a team of 5 researchers, and we're based at the universities of Aberdeen, Cambridge and Manchester. And combining historical research and ethnographic fieldwork, and we trace music's role as a form of cultural encounter between North Africa and Southern Europe in both colonial and post-colonial settings. So we're interested here in how music has been used and continues to be used to suit different cultural and political agendas, and for example, to legitimize European colonialism, to perform the idea of a collective cultural memory across the Strait of Gibraltar, particularly as it relates to the mythology of Al-Andalus, as a form of cultural diplomacy and dialogue between different ethnic and religious communities, and as a form of transnational identity formation for North African communities in the diaspora. Now, in this online series, we want to broaden our scope a little bit to examine the rich and diverse range of musical genres and sonic practices that crisscross the West characterize the region. So the series features a range of academic speakers, workshops and concerts. And if you want any more information on the series, on our research or any of our upcoming events, please do take a look at our website, www.musicalencounters.co.uk. And you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the usual social media platforms. So before introducing Jonathan, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping, though I think we're probably used to these online events by now. Please keep your microphone muted throughout the presentation. Jonathan will speak for around about 40 to 45 minutes, and then following that, we'll have around 20 to 25 minutes or so for questions. If you do want to ask a question, please indicate in the chat, and then I'll invite you to ask your question. You can also use the sort of raised hand icon as well, if you can find it on Zoom. Or alternatively, feel free to write the question directly into the chat, and I will read it out for you. So that you're aware, we will be recording, and I noticed Veronica has already started the recording, so thanks for that, Veronica. And also we're going to be live streaming on Facebook for those who can't make it as well. The recording will be available on YouTube as well. If you are uncomfortable, then we sort of understand if you want to turn off your camera as well. So I'm just going to go live on Facebook. If you just bear with me for a moment. This just takes a couple of seconds to set up. Sorry, something went wrong. That's not very helpful. Let's try that one more time. There we go. So just bear with me. I'll get this set up. Internet is lagging today. Here we go, go live. So that should be going live now. So setting up, good. I'll let it work in the background. So I'm going to introduce our speaker now. So Jonathan Glasser is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at William and Mary. It's a university located in Williamsburg, Virginia, founded in 1693. He's the author of The Lost Paradise, Andalusi Music in Urban North Africa, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2016, a book that I know that everybody on our research team has probably read and cites frequently. So it's great to have Jonathan here. His research articles have appeared in American Ethnologist, Anthropological Quarterly, and the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. During 2019 and 2020, he was a resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Paris, where he was working on his current book project about Muslim-Jewish musical intimacy in Algeria and its diaspora. And it's this research that Jonathan will present on today. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Glasser. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's great to be here. I am just going to stop sharing, and I'm going to start sharing one more time to make sure that we have sound. Okay, it's there. Share. And I'm going to go from the beginning. All right. So thank you so much, Matthew, for inviting me. It's great to be with you, with all of you. I've been following the work of past and present musical encounters across the Strait of Gibraltar project since its inception. And I'm delighted to be able to join in this conversation, these sonic conversations in the Western Mediterranean series. The one thing is that somehow I can't see any of you right now. So I just want to hear one thing. So I'm going to call on Eric. Eric, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, that's great. And so what I'm going to ask is if there's any problem, if something strange happens, you know, say something audible. That would be great. And the other thing is, yeah, so, you know, we in the William Mary Middle Eastern Ensemble, we often teach our student, you know, the student listeners to say yes, salam, and things like that after we play, as we play. So, you know, there will be some sort of feedback. So if anything happens negative or really positive, feel free to jump in. So I am very excited to be sharing this work with you. And I want to underline that some of this is work that I've shared, published fairly recently. So there was an edited volume that Vanessa and I were both in, Jewish Musical Interactions, Performing Cultures Between North Africa and France, which it came out in the fall, this past fall. But some of this is actually quite new and very fresh. And so I'm very eager to get your feedback about the ideas I'm going to be working through today. So what I'm going to be doing is speaking about my current book project, which is about Muslim-Jewish musical intimacy in Algeria and its diaspora. But this project came out of an earlier one, which Matthew mentioned, this book, The Lost Paradise, Andalusi Music in Urban North Africa, that came out in 2016. And I want to give you a little bit of background so that you can understand where my current project is coming from. So this first project was an attempt to look at a long-term, century-long project of musical revival centered in Algeria, but finding an expression across the Maghreb. And this was very much a project that was concerned with the interface of professional musicians and amateur musicians and music aficionados. And it focused on the Andalusi music tradition, so the art music, instrumental and vocal music tradition from urban, the urban Maghreb, which is said to have roots in medieval Spain. So that was the focus of this first project. And in this book, I noted very often the presence of both Muslim and Jewish listeners and musicians and other figures in this movement of revival. But it was not specifically about the Muslim-Jewish musical question per se, even if nearly everyone I was talking about was either Muslim or Jewish. However, since I published this book, I've felt emboldened to address this Muslim-Jewish musical question more directly. And I say emboldened because I have found an enthusiastic reception for this project in North Africa among musicians and listeners. And I've also had some great exchanges with academic colleagues in Algeria and beyond about this project. However, I should also say that I've encountered some pushback, mainly in the United States, to this project as well. So that's included some accusations of essentialism and suggestions, more gentle suggestions, that I could tell the story of Algerian music without ever mentioning if the protagonists I'm talking about are Muslim or Jewish. And although I found some of this pushback frustrating at times, I've also found it to be very helpful from a theoretical perspective, that these are provocative questions. And they raise for me some very big ones, right? So what is essentialism? What is its alternative? Is talking about Muslim-Jewish difference or about Muslim and Jews tout court essentializing? Are there non-essentializing ways to do this? When is Muslimness and Jewishness relevant? And for whom? And what should we be doing when some claim that it is relevant and others claim that it's not? So there's many, many ways to get at these questions, but the angle I'm going to be pursuing today is to focus on the question of boundaries. This metaphor, a classic metaphor in anthropology and sociology. And while this metaphor is old, and I would say not super fashionable right now, I actually do find it quite useful for thinking about this question of Muslim-Jewish musical intimacy, even if I think we need to think about that metaphor very, very carefully, and also, I hope to show, to expand on it. But before I trace the genealogy of this concept, of this metaphor, I want to first trace a genealogy of musicians. And many of these musicians, you've heard of many of these musicians. I'm sure many of you have. The first one I want to start with is Maurice El-Mediouni, who was born in 1928. He is a great living voice from Algeria, originally from the Algerian port city of Oran in western Algeria, who left after Algerian independence for France. He was a musician in his youth. He also worked as a tailor and as a textile manufacturer, eventually coming back to music in France. And eventually he left his home in Marseille to move to Netanya in Israel, which is where he lives now. So I'm starting with him partly because he is this very well-known pianist and songwriter, and he is among the very last Jewish Arabophone musicians who actually grew up in Algeria. And he's had this very active performing career, particularly in recent decades. So I'm just going to play you a little excerpt from this song that he wrote and he's famous for performing. Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome. And there's going to be a chorus in Arabic and a French verse from this song. And we'll just listen to this and I'll say a few things about it. Just a few, little excerpt of this song. By the way, all of these transcriptions are very, very fresh. And I'm totally open to your corrections and suggestions. Voilà. أهلاً وسهلاً أهلاً بكم أهلاً وسهلاً أهلاً بكم فرحتوا قلبي نفرح بكم جيتوا يا حبابي يا محلى اليوم أهلاً وسهلاً أهلاً بكم. Salut mes chers amis de vous voir là tous réunis. J'en suis heureux, j'en suis ravi. Quant aux absents, qu'ils soient bénis, ce n'est que remis. Okay, great. So this is just like a little teaser of this song, right? And it's a total cliche to say this is infectious, but I can't think of any better term, right? It's totally infectious music. And it's very self-consciously about blending, right? Arabic and French, Algerian and Afro-Cuban sounds, what he talks about as the left-hand rumba and the right-hand oriental, right? So for listeners who are in the know, it's very recognizably Jewish sounding, not only because its composer and performer is Jewish, right? But also because it fits into a post-war light musical genre, sometimes known as Franco-Arab, which has this code switching, right, between French and colloquial Arabic. And is largely associated with a group of Jewish performers. Now, what I want to do with this genealogy, however, is to move back a little bit. And so if we go back a generation, we have Maurice's paternal uncle, Saoud, or Masoud Lohane, Saoud Lohane, who was murdered in 1943 with his teenage son in Sobibor extermination camp, and who was a great performer of Algerian urban musical traditions. Here he's performing a housie, a long colloquial song from the inland city of Tlemcen, not too far from Oran. Again, many listeners would recognize this as a Jewish singer, even if they didn't recognize this as Saoud Lohane necessarily. And here is just a little taste.
نشكي ضمري يا رافع السماء طبر على حالي اياك استراح
Okay, so this is a very different musical style, of course. So we've moved from this kind of Franco-Arab post-World War II sound to something that's very deeply rooted in an urban classical and semi-classical tradition. Now, this singer and cafe bar owner, Saoud, pictured here, was in turn the mentor of Sultana Daoud, also known as Renette Lohanaise, another great singer with a very, very famous voice, who, like her mentor's nephew, right, like Maurice Maldioni, had a second career in France after she moved there, after Algerian independence. Now here she's singing a short introductory improvisation where she's actually singing directly of her blindness. And the announcer, who you hear at the very beginning, states that she is the student of Saoud.
polyphone, Renette, Lohanaise, élève de Saoud. ربي كتب عليا دايما من القلب حزين ربي كتب عليا دايما القلب حزين نظف علي ضوء عيني هذا الشي مكتوب في الجبين
Okay, great. So we have Renette as the student of Saoud, right? So we're going from Maurice to his uncle. But if we keep going back, we can find that in turn, Saoud, his uncle, had two paternal uncles born in the middle of the 19th century who were likewise professional musicians, also in Oran. And they themselves were the children of Saoud Lohanai's grandfather, also named Saoud, who was born before the French conquest, and who was likewise a musician. And one of this older Saoud's musician sons would marry Rachel Mediouni, the daughter of Ishwa Mediouni, better known as Makshish, who was one of the leading performers of the repertoire of Tlemcen, this inland city not too far from Oran, who died in 1899. So he died before he could be recorded. I also don't know of any photographs of him, but he's a very deeply important figure in the lineage of Andalusi music performers in Tlemcen. He was the teacher of Boudelfa, Mohammed bin Shaban, died in 1914, who in turn was a key transmitter to Sheikh al-Arabi bin Sari, who's understood as the key figure in the Andalusi repertoire of Tlemcen, right? Boudelfa and Sheikh al-Arabi bin Sari both being Muslims. So this genealogical position is incredibly important. It's well remembered in Tlemcen, but we know very, very little about this figure of Makshish, except that he was written about by Routi Bouali in his short book, Kashf al-Qina and Alat al-Sama, Lifting the Veil from the Instruments of Listening, a lithographed book that was published in 1904. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read two passages from two different parts of this book where he talks about Makshish. Okay, so Bouali writes, "In what remains of this music, I have found evidence that in the lands of Al-Andalus, this art contained 24 modes, while in our age, what remains of these are only 12 modes, and this among the strongest singers. There was in Tlemcen a Jew named Makshish, who I used to spend evenings listening to, and he had command of 16 modes, and today we have those who are deemed praiseworthy and skilled for knowing but 4. And then, in another passage, some of those who were most reliable also told me that in Tlemcen there was a singer by the name of Al-Hajj Hamadi Baghdadi, who made the pilgrimage to Mecca. He agreed that the aforementioned Jewish sheikh Makshish, whose descendants are still found in abundance, was so revered that one day he entered a house in the neighborhood where a nighttime wedding party was being held. When he started to sound the strings, the baby of one of the women up on the rooftops began to cry. The mother restrained the baby with her hand out of fear that the hosts of the banquet would reprimand her. She ran off with the baby to another place. When she calmed down, she found her son had died from the grip without her knowledge. Also, the friend of the man at the banquet came by, but even though the man had not seen his friend for a long time, he did not greet him except by motions of the hand so as not to disturb the singer. And so Bouali actually ends his book with this strange anecdote, right? And I find this to be extremely haunting, not least for the way that it shows Maurice el-Mediouni of today to be the audible end of a very long, varied, dense, and largely inaudible genealogy of musicians that intertwines Jews and Muslims in various ways. I also find it provocative for thinking through the question of boundaries I would like to treat today. So someone might be able to tell the story of Algerian music without mentioning if people are Muslim or Jewish, but Bouali, right, pictured here, certainly could not do this. Both times he mentions Makshish, he says he was Yehudi or Israeli, right, that he was Jewish or Israelite, right? And this state of affairs is even more striking if we give credence to a story that still circulates in Tlemcen today, that Makshish taunted a former Jewish student of his by pointing to Boudelfa at his side and saying, Shuf had Muslim sidik lima ataytiksh ataytu. Look at this Muslim, your master. What I did not give to you, I gave to him. And if Bouali is not willing to avoid this, then neither am I. Right? So this is a kind of long introduction to the theoretical angle that I want to get to today. So what do we do with this? This is where I find it very interesting to start thinking about these matters together with the metaphor of boundaries. So in anthropology and sociology, this metaphor is very much tied up with the work of the Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth, whose 1969 collection, Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, is a really key text. So the basic innovation associated with Barth is the move from thinking about ethnic groups as constituted primarily by internal traits to thinking about them as constituted against one another. On the one hand, the boundary is an effect of sheer classificatory difference. In other words, the boundary is a way of talking about social difference. On the other hand, boundaries also get actively made. There's agency. They get built up, elaborated, maintained, regulated, reinforced, performed. In this, the boundary is not an equal, even, equally weighted line. Certain parts of it, certain, quote, diacritica, get picked out as sites of differentiation, of self or other construction, of boundary work. This can be at the expense of other diacritica, as well as of other aspects of behavior and representation that might point to commonality rather than difference. And so this is just like a little scrawl. I do this a lot. And so this is a little bit of this image of, okay, here's a line, but then parts of it get elaborated, right? So we have this elaboration, 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 elaboration. This is what he's talking about as the diacritica, all right? And schematized a little bit differently, it would look a little bit like this. Now, Barth can be read productively, right, alongside some of the classic literature on Muslim-Jewish relationships in North Africa. So this literature, which tends to focus for demographic reasons on Morocco, can be divided into two, or has often been divided into two camps. One that emphasizes hierarchy and conflict between Muslims and Jews in the relatively self-contained nature of Jewish communities in the region, and one that emphasizes more or less harmonious integration of Jews in the broader social fabric. Now, I don't have time in the talk to talk through how this has developed in more recent decades in the current scholarship, particularly that which focuses on the colonial context. But suffice it to say that Barth can be helpful in circling some of the points of contact between these two supposedly opposing camps. So, for example, in the integrationist camp, we encountered the idea that there were traditionally certain spheres in which the boundary between Jews and Muslims were elaborated. Okay, so for example, clothing, residence, worship, marriage, right? And other spheres, such as, say, market exchange, in which the boundary blurred or receded, right? Hence the dotted lines here. So in Lawrence Rosen's classic work on the central Moroccan town of Sefrou, he made the important point that the Muslim-Jewish boundary in the realm of kinship could, in fact, lead to conviviality between Muslims and Jews, in that the kinship boundary removed Jews from the realm of competitive exchange that characterized the relationships between kinsmen. So ultimately, I tend to read this sort of argument, right, drawn from Rosen, not so much as an anti-hierarchical one, but rather as one that pays attention to the potentially intimate affordances of hierarchy. And I draw your attention to Anastasia Pilyavsky's very interesting new book about hierarchy in North India. It's really, really fascinating work, and I'm kind of in the midst of that, and it's really been percolating in my mind here. Okay, and I particularly like this picture of a Jewish musician in a marketplace, by the way. So in broad terms, the Algerian case is not so different from the Moroccan one that's treated in the classic literature. So the Algerian examples are not so wildly different. So here too, we find a classificatory difference that has its behavioral counterparts, some of which get particular attention in the elaboration of a sense of the boundary. And here, Joël Bahloul's work is absolutely essential, right? And so thinking about, for example, what she's written on cuisine, we can see in Bahloul's work this idea of cuisine as a rich site for boundary work among Algerian Jews. So on the one hand, the basic ingredients of the cuisine were shared with Muslim neighbors without respect for that Muslim-Jewish boundary. On the other hand, and not unlike the sonic boundary work that Vanessa, you've described in your article from a few months ago in Journal of North African Studies, this material provides the raw materials with which a very finely drawn sense of difference was drawn. So for Bahloul, this cultural work responded to the demands of Jewish dietary law of kashrut, but it was not confined to that, right? It goes well beyond those demands. Now, what makes the Algerian case particularly complex is the deep presence of Frenchness and of France. The French colonial presence had far-reaching consequences for the Muslim-Jewish boundary. So the summary en masse granting of French citizenship to the bulk of Algerian Jews in 1870 had slow but very far-reaching effects on the Muslim-Jewish relationship. It made most Jews French citizens, while most Muslims remained colonial subjects. Compulsory French education eventually shifted the Jewish population from primarily Arabophone to primarily Francophone. And while some Jews fought for Algerian independence in the 1950s, and more than many realize actually stayed after independence, the vast majority of the Algerian Jewish population left for France alongside the European population. And in fact, in France, as Hichem Aidi has pointed out in his work, there developed an ambiguity with regard to whom the term pied noir refers. So it seems to mean, this term pied noir seems to refer to European origin settlers of Algeria and their descendants, but has also sometimes covered Algerian Jews. So in this way, the Muslim-Jewish boundary in the Algerian case has post-62 been partly subsumed and obscured within the Algerian French boundary. Right? So in light of this, it's understandable that the historical prominence of Jews in urban Algerian musical practice has been held up in recent decades as a challenge to the conflation of Algerian Jews with the settler population. Furthermore, has offered a challenge to the notion of a firm Muslim-Jewish boundary. So music gets talked about by enthusiasts and scholars as something that transcends the boundary, a bit like that marketplace in the Moroccan literature. It is said to be a durable relic of an earlier time, a sign of some kind of pre-colonial porousness, a commentary on what was really there that has been buried under discourses of hurt, rupture, policies of separation, etc. This resembles what the sociologist Andreas Wimmer would describe as the expansion of the boundary, In other words, both Muslims and Jews as indigènes or as Algerians, or like something like boundary blurring. But when I speak to Algerian Muslims and Jews who talk about such things, what I hear is a little bit different. All right, so instead of this image of a kind of effacing of the boundary in the musical sphere, instead what I often hear is an acceptance of this idea of boundary, but then a suggestion that music served as cement, as the cement, right, that bound together, that joined two otherwise distinct communities. So music here is not so much transcendent as it is connective, a hyphen, a social glue. So perhaps we can think of it as a domain in which the boundary is absent. But in the insider discourse, what it's more like is something inside the boundary that then joins the groups. So it's something a little bit like what Eduardo Viegas de Castro has described as an idiom of brotherhood. There's difference, and then there is a contingent relationship of sameness that gets tacked on, that gets achieved through a third term. And what's that third term here? It's music, right? So this is this sort of idiom of brotherhood that I find to be very widespread in the communities I'm working with. However, all right, so that's the idiom of brotherhood on one hand. It does not take long to find various kinds of cracks in that facade of brotherhood, both in the historical record and in contemporary memory. So first, we can see instances of rivalry where there is actually competition between Muslims and Jews over control of repertoire. So with respect to boundaries, right, with respect to this model, rivalry actually bears a pretty close resemblance to the idiom of brotherhood, in that there is a sense of music as basically homogeneous, right? There's kind of music, right? And music is existing in the boundary between discrete communities. However, instead of acting as cement, right, music becomes an object of struggle. So in rivalry, there's an attempt to bind the music to a particular community, an attempt to absorb it into one or the other side of the boundary, an attempt to foreclose the possibility of music bringing sameness. Now, while this is not ubiquitous, the idiom of rivalry does come up, not surprisingly, in situations, as in the interwar period, where there's clear competition for resources between Muslim and Jewish performers, either as individuals or as members of religious, ethno-religiously defined collectivities, such as amateur music associations, which in some cases tended to be predominantly Jewish or predominantly Muslim. And we can even get, I would say, a hint of this sort of rivalry in its individualized form in that tale of Maqshish's rebuke that I mentioned before to his Jewish former student. However, far more ubiquitous in the historical record is the idiom of hierarchy. Hierarchy is quite distinct from rivalry in that the latter, right, rivalry presumes something close to equality, while the former, hierarchy, presumes its opposite. So the most visible form of hierarchy lies in the fact of Jewish prominence as professional musicians in the Maghreb. So professional musicianship has traditionally been understood in the Maghreb and many, many other places as a lower status occupation. And so it's possible to interpret Jewish specialization in music making as an expression of a hierarchical boundary, rather than its transcendence or amelioration. So in a sense, this points toward the positive side of hierarchy in the sense of Rosen's argument, right? So in the idea that the lack of competition around kinship opened up opportunities for Muslim-Jewish conviviality in Sefru, right? So if hierarchy affirms the boundary, it also shows how the other side of the boundary might be temporarily attractive. It's a sort of gravitational pull to that other side. So it pulls people across that boundary temporarily, in that it gives the superior group, right, an opportunity to let off steam, right? Jews and music come to be conjoined occasions for license. Okay, so this is like one kind of way that we can read hierarchy into this musical picture. On the other hand, there's also the negative face of hierarchy, with Jewish performers, in some cases, allegedly specializing in lighter repertoires, or even debasing higher prestige genres through linguistic solecism, right, through supposed mistakes, or simply through bad taste, right? Here, not only is music making expressing a hierarchical boundary, but it introduces musical heterogeneity that can be read as a further elaboration of that hierarchical boundary. Okay, so what's happening here is there is a kind of division of music in terms of different registers that correspond to that hierarchy. In other words, it might not just be that the idea of suspension or effacing or transcending of the boundary implied in the idiom of brotherhood is out the window, right? It's not just that, but it's also that that third term, right, might not be a single term after all, but is instead a variegated set of musical diacritica. So here, social difference leads to musical difference, right? There's social difference, and then it produces musical difference. So I've been talking about two basic ways of thinking about music so far here in the Muslim-Jewish boundary. So in one, there is a boundary, but music doesn't partake of that boundary, right? Instead, music is an anti-boundary or a non-boundary or a bridge. In this other one that I've gotten to, music is part of the boundary, or we could say that the boundary impinges on music and gets extended by music. So here, music is an expression of hierarchy or a site of rivalry. Yet the contrasting but connected idioms of brotherhood, rivalry, and hierarchy, I don't think exhaust the possible models of the boundary here. Because in addition, and this is the kind of model I want to end the formal part of my talk on, I think we can also find what Viveros de Castro calls the idiom of affinity. So if all men are brothers-in-law rather than brothers, then a relation can only exist between what differs and insofar as it differs. So in concrete terms, I think we can find something like affinity whenever there is a more or less egalitarian, more or less non-rivalrous Muslim-Jewish relationship around music, but in such a way that Muslimness or Jewishness remain musically present to the observer. So the classic example of this, which I'm working on in a separate piece, is the question of voice, of a sort of this idea among many musicians and aficionados that one can tell a Jewish singer from a Muslim singer simply by listening to the way they speak, the timbre of the voice, vibrato, a whole bunch of other characteristics. And there's also other examples of affinity as well. So for me, this brings to mind the question of sacred repertoires that are specific to Muslims or Jews, the use of distinct scripts when writing down song texts in notebooks, and of course also distinct genre preferences with regard to profane repertoire, including with regard to code switching between Arabic and French. Now, when we really think about it, right, we've talked about affinity, we've talked about rivalry, hierarchy, and brotherhood. All of these idioms can coexist and layer on top of one another, right? They don't all work, right? There's friction between them, but they also can come together in some really interesting ways. And I'm particularly struck how the idiom of affinity can encompass the idiom of brotherhood. For example, I frequently encounter the claim that Jews and Muslims were the same. So this is like something that people frequently say, Jews and Muslims were the same. But then frequently this gets paired with the assertion that Jews had distinctive ways of pronouncing or intoning what they sang. So in Barthian terms, this is to say that if we are going to talk in terms of boundaries, music can do two things at once in this case. It's both shared and it's inflected in different ways, thereby elaborating boundaries. So it's difference through connection and connection through difference. It's a shared thing that, in being embodied, passes through one or the other side of the boundary. In passing through, it retains the trace of its passage, and then it can even be taken up on the other side with those traces still there. When we get into the final, then, it's as if we were talking about music as the boundary. And in here, what's distinctive about this is it's music as the boundary, and the boundary is an occasion for stopping. It's also an occasion for communication, right? So this, I'm inspired a little bit of this idea of edge effects that comes from ecology, right? So the idea of the fence or the border as a space that one actually goes to for activity, for meeting. It is always potentially a bridge, but unlike the classic thin homogeneous line of the boundary, this is a thick, internally heterogeneous line, right? So there's occasion here for trying things on inside that boundary. It's spacious enough for sharing, for differentiation, and so on. So I like to think of it as even perhaps a shared membrane, or as a two-sided screen, something that Joël Bahloul has inspired me to think through, a passage between the self and the other. So it's a complex shared substance rather than simply a proxy for commonality, as in the standalone idiom of brotherhood. So note the implication here, which is that there's a buried baseline of social sameness, and then there's the entry of music in the making of difference, right? Conceptually speaking, there is a sort of sameness, and then there's music coming in, and that is this medium through which difference gets made. So in thinking through the question of the boundary here, and I'm going to close now so that we have time for some discussion, and in trying to make it safe for us to talk about Muslimness and Jewishness in music in Algeria and the wider Maghreb, I want to underline very clearly here that I'm not trying to say that Muslimness versus Jewishness is always relevant, or that we should always be talking in terms of verses, right? Far from it. In fact, I am particularly wary of falling into this trap when thinking about musical activity in the present, when I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure to frame everything in terms of Muslim-Jewish reconciliation. I want to make room for plurality and complexity here, which in many cases actually means putting the question of Muslim-Jewish difference on the back burner. All right, so it may be that it should be placed on the back burner. Yet to banish that difference entirely in favor of an anodyne notion of cultural, republican, or universal sameness would render much of the Maghrebi social fabric illegible, unintelligible, both to scholars and to its constituents past and present. And I, for one, feel that to do so would be a tremendous loss. So I'm going to end the talk here. I have other things I could show you and share with you, but I'm eager to have a back and forth, and also not to take too much of your time. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm eager to get out of this so I can see all of your faces.
Thanks ever so much, Jonathan. If you're able to stop sharing, there you are. Fantastic. Thanks ever so much for a wonderful talk. Do a virtual round of applause. There's some really fascinating things that have come up here. I'm really sort of taken by the sort of nuanced approach to the idea of boundary, the idea of music as an anti-boundary. I find that particularly enticing, and also how music can extend boundaries. I see a lot of parallels in my own work here, actually, where you're mentioning the concept of brotherhood and how difference can be sort of elided in the search for sameness, where Jews and Muslims become the same, but also at the same time difference is marked through certain repertoires or ways of singing. And I've come across the same sort of things in my own field work in Spanish Moroccan musical projects of sort of cultural encounter, where on the one hand this idea of sameness, that flamenco and Andalusi music, for example, is the same, it comes from the same roots, yet musicians also comment on the difficulties in fusing these projects. So there's very interesting parallels there. So thank you. I'm going to open up the floor for any questions. As I said before, do raise your virtual hand or pop a note into the chat, and I will invite you forward for a question. Do we have any questions to start with? Vanessa, over to you.
Yes, hi. Thanks so much, Jonathan. This is great. I'm always really enjoy what you have to give us. So thank you. I actually am interested a little bit in revisiting the idea of the genealogy as well,
Mhm.
because I think that that's such an important part of like the Maghrebi and the post-Andalusian kind of musical and religious worlds. Um, and I'm interested in it as well, you know, because it seems to kind of flow through so many of the contemporary iterations of this music. So can you expand a little bit more on that genealogical aspect and how that might connect to the boundary and to the non-boundary?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I try to think a lot through that question of the genealogy in The Lost Paradise, in my first book. And I think that one of the things that's really exciting and complex about genealogies is they are about boundaries, right? Like and they're also about, I mean, there's many things happening, right? One can create certain boundaries around a genealogy, right? So that a genealogy itself, right? But then inside a genealogy, I think in kind of the lived practice of it, there is the boundary of generations, which is like a really fascinating one, and that's very deeply connected to the kind of discourse and anxieties around transmission that I think, you know, in my book I argue is kind of at the heart of this question of revival, right? Revival is an anxious act, and it's and so the so that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'm gonna, you know, there's a lot that one could do with that, and you know, I'd be curious to kind of see where you would go with that, Vanessa. But for me, one of the things that this brings to mind is the question of genealogies through kinship and genealogies through other kinds of kinship, right? Kind of kinship of blood versus kinship of teaching, right? And so that's a really interesting part of this. So in the article that I published that came out in the fall, you know, I started to try out some ideas about, well, can we think about music as a substance that's a little bit like blood, right? But that is very conveniently kind of available in the North African context for building relationships between people who belong to endogamous communities, right? So and so that's part of it where I'm like, like music feels like something that we can start to think about as dense and as a substance and as a medium, right, of building relationship. And this is, I guess, where I would move away from something in Barth. You know, Barth loves to talk about, you know, there's the categories, social categories, and then there's these diacritica kind of get added to it. And the diacritica, you can kind of give or take, you can take them or leave them in a way. They're like, you know, there are things like clothing, there are things like, you know, poetry, there are things like food. But, you know, I think that those of us who work on music and performance and all sorts of other things, I think what we should really be thinking about is like, like that stuff is the space of making, right? Like, it's not like there's the boundary and then it kind of gets expressed in the music. Like, that is where the boundary is partly existing, right? So it's like, and that's the part of it. I know this is getting a little bit away from, I think, you know, what you're getting at before, Vanessa, but that's the part of it where I'm thinking like, like genealogy, this idiom of genealogy that's so important in the Maghrebi context. We need to really think about that in terms of lots of different media, not just in terms of blood, but in terms of some other things, including the musical.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Vanessa, for the question. We have a question from Eric Calderwood. Back to you.
Yeah, first of all, did I unmute? I think I did. First of all, thank you, Jonathan, for just a beautiful and wonderful talk. It's always so inspiring to hear you. I wanted to ask you about another boundary, geographic and national boundaries. And not only about the kind of Algeria-France divide, which you referred to a little bit in your talk, but actually triangulating with Israel, and where this where this question comes from is that actually, I think 2 years ago, I had an opportunity to see Maurice Medioni play in Israel with the Israeli Andalusian Orchestra in Ashdod. And so I'm curious to hear you think about when that boundary work, so he performed this kind of repertoire, these kind of light Franco-Arab music with code switching between usually Maghribi, Arabic and French, often with people in the audience in Ashdod singing along in both French and Arabic. And so I'm curious to know, how does that boundary work change when shifted to a new geographic environment? Is it the same? I mean, presumably it means different, even though it's the same material, it means different. It kind of conveys something different when brought to a new place. And so I'm curious to know how you triangulate Israel within this kind of space that you're drawing out that has to do with Muslim-Jewish relations. And you seem to draw out like how that got altered in the kind of cauldron of, or the crucible of colonialism. And I'm wondering now how you triangulate Israel into that, since, as you know, Medioni and others have kind of had this career that now triangulates both Israel, France, and North Africa.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really great question. I'm going to have to, first of all, think about it. And I'm also going to have to say that this project so far has really kind of been like very squarely focused on Algeria and the Algerian diaspora in France. And I did do that for a particular reason. Like, I mean, I think, obviously like Maghribi, like thinking about Maghribi society and certainly about music, we can't like be stuck in these national borders. But I thought that there was something conveniently focused about the Algerian case, and also very particular about it, right? Given its centrality in the music industry, but then also the very strong sense of rupture, right? So I've been focused on that side of things, and certainly when you go into France, there's lots going on in terms of like how things stay the same and change, right? In terms of the Israeli side of things, that's a great question, and I think I could learn from you, Eric. I haven't done field work in Israel, and I'm I'm certainly aware of some of what's going on, but and so I'm wary of actually saying very much here. The one thing I do think is really fascinating, though, is how in the Algerian Jewish case, there's this movement from Algeria to France, and then often in Maurice and Medioni's case, but many others, there's also this kind of move in later life to the Israeli context. And I would imagine that it would not be so wildly different from some of the things I've found in France, which is this really important boundary among North African Jews between Moroccans and Algerians. It's not just between Moroccans and Algerians, but also Tunisians. But some of that has to do with kind of size of population and the sort of musical effects of that size, right? And there's also the various other sorts of kind of questions of rivalry that come up. They're not purely demographic, right? So that would be something I would not at all be shocked, right, to kind of find. And I'm imagining that would be a real musical question that you would probably was going on in rehearsal before the concert you heard in Ashdod, right? But you might have anyway. I'd love to hear your take on it.
I'm still thinking about it, but we'll obviously continue this conversation. But thanks. I mean, my initial thought is I wonder, since the Ashdod community is primarily Moroccan descent,
right?
But there was a really rapturous reception of Maurice and Medioni, and the program was called Algiers, Algiers.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what are the moments in which that Moroccan-Algerian distinction becomes elided and subsumed within a larger Mizrahi project?
Absolutely.
Beyond the kind of specific case of this performance, I'm trying to think about how this boundary work that is impinging upon or produced by you presented both options, religious difference, also gets inflected by language practices and
Oh,
national
for sure.
difference,
For
and
sure.
how those get changed when it gets translated first from North Africa to Europe and then from Europe to Israel.
And keep in
But
mind, there's also, there's a really important Algerian presence in Morocco, both in terms of people and in terms of music, particularly among Moroccan Jews. So that's the other piece of it, is that already in the, the evidence we have for this is more from the early 20th century, but you have this very important kind of Algerian style in Morocco that's very, very much linked to Moroccan Jews and to Algerian Jews who wound up in Morocco. So it's and that's another piece of it. Actually, I think that would be probably the most that would be a really, I think, interesting way of getting at some of those questions you're talking about, Eric, in the Israeli context. Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for your question there. I have a direct question here from Sheila Mackenzie Brown. Did you find any boundaries formed by the remnants of traditional religion?
Yes. So the religious question is really important here. So this talk has been all about a profane repertoire, right? But that profane repertoire, both among Jews and Muslims, has a sacred counterpart. So kind of a conceptual way of thinking about it is kind of with three braids. You have a kind of the central strand, which is this profane repertoire, and then you have a braid, a strand here, which is Jewish sacred practice, and another strand that's Muslim sacred practice, and then those twine around that central strand, right? And so the way this works is that basically you have melodies that are conceptualized as being stored mainly in that profane repertoire, but then get diverted to use in a sacred context, usually with Arabic for Muslims and Hebrew for Jews. But there is actually also a religious repertoire in Arabic, right, among Jews as well. So it's but that's the basic, that's a really important other piece of this picture that I didn't get into today. But yeah, absolutely. And that's a really interesting space for thinking about kind of professional performance. So something that is an interesting thing that comes up in the colonial period in Algeria and other in the Algerian context, I'm comfortable with this, is you can find stories, first of all, of Muslims visiting synagogues or listening in to capture melodies, right? And then to use it in profane repertoire. You sometimes hear stories of Jews going to Sufi gatherings and picking up melodies in a similar way. You also hear stories about Muslims picking up actual Hebrew prayers simply by overhearing, right, and kind of imitating what they hear, prayers and also paraliturgical poems. And you also find some Jewish performers who perform religiously tinged, Islamically tinged repertoire, right? So so this is basically Medih, so like songs in praise of the Prophet Muhammad. So that's like that's the sort of thing, and that's a really interesting terrain that sometimes gets really, really touchy. There's some great stories and kind of leads about the issues that could come up in those sorts of moments. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you so much for the question. So I have a couple more questions here. Probably not one from Judith's cat. So this is a question coming from Sarah Nasa. I would love to hear a little bit about Salim Khalali, who is one of the greatest figures from the Algerian Jewish community, and maybe the role he played in this Muslim-Jewish relationship.
Yeah, so a really interesting figure. I feel like we have multiple people here, but I'm thinking particularly of Chris Silver, who is like, I think, a great person to talk to about Salim Khalali, and it comes up in his work in a great way. Yeah, so another fascinating figure, from Eastern Algeria, and has this very interesting story that is somewhat disputed in terms of like what happened and how he survived the war in Paris. Yeah, but absolutely fascinating figure. And again, a very trans-Maghrebi figure as well. Chris, go for it.
Yep, Chris, you have your hand raised. Do you want to jump in?
My hand raised was not to cut into that question. In fact, Sarah and I are neighbors and friends here in Montreal. It was to ask another question. So I want to give you the time, but I have some other questions wherever I am in the queue.
You can go now, Chris, if you want to.
Okay. Yep. So first of all, I wanted to say, Jonathan, just thank you as always. I mean, you know, every time I hear you talk, even in this medium of Zoom, I find it intellectually nourishing, soul nourishing. And so I'm very happy to be here with you and with so many other faces and friends. And I have some, I don't know what they are, questions, comments,
Sure.
Disjointed thoughts. And so I'm going to try and assemble them, and you can bat them away or go for it or whatever. So, you know, the first question, and it's related to Hilali. The first question I was sort of thinking about is related to Hilali. It's related to genealogy. It's related to this question of the Franco-Arab repertoire song. And, you know, my question is, you know, what happens if we backdate it? So rather than a sort of a post-war phenomenon as one existing at a much earlier moment in time. So certainly, like if we look at, you know, the world of recording already in the 1920s, artists are, you know, moving between French and Arabic, and not only Jews, Muslims as well. So I'm wondering how that sort of adds to this question of differentiation, shared qualities, and for Hilali, who I'm thinking of in this case is Mohammed al-Kamel, an Algerian Muslim who, of course, is quite famous for mixing French and Arabic, or even a figure like Igor Bouchen, who's, of course, you know, doing something very different with piano and instrumental music, but certainly someone who's blending genres. And so that's my first question, sort of like what happens if we sort of move the question about French Arabic music to an earlier moment and outside of just sort of something associated with Jews. If we
that's a really great that's a great point. Were you gonna say something else, Chris?
I have other. I'll try and make it quicker than that last one. There have two other questions. One is about this concept of rivalry, which made me think of Sophie Roberts' work and some of the discussion she has about status anxiety as rivalry tending to status anxiety, which I think also gets into questions of class. And so, you know, when we're talking about Jews and Muslims, you know, we're already talking about the majority of the population of Algeria, of course. You know, and so, you know, does it make sense to talk about Jews and Muslims and their entanglement, the concrete or blood or whatever it is that binds them? Or does it make sense to focus on a sort of a smaller subset of Jews and Muslims of a certain class? And then we can work in this concept of status anxiety, which in fact moves us in many directions, right?
Absolutely.
The Muslim associations that are formed in the interwar period, in fact, are sort of asserting their position through their middle classness, right? Like moving away.
Yeah.
So that these are the thoughts that run through my head and that I'm now projecting here on.
Oh, absolutely. So let me just kind of start backwards. You know, I'll just make a couple of things. I mean, absolutely. It's and so I mean, whenever you talk about kind of like Muslims and Jews, that's like a very I mean, I think a big criticism of that is like, well, it's, that's not very specific, right? Like it's like who are you talking about? And so definitely in my first book, I was really eager to try to kind of read some of this questions very much about social class, right? Like that's like there's these sometimes very sharp differences. And sometimes, there's also sometimes like misrecognition that comes into things, right? Or just multiple ways of reading a situation, right? So, you can sometimes find situations where one person is saying, well, these people are like they're totally low, right? And totally, but then on the other hand, you get evidence that actually that person is being treated as low thinks of themselves as a competitor with the person making that judgment. So there's like very interesting issues about status and class that come in here. So I think that one thing I'm still thinking through in this project is like, what is this about, right? Like, because I can't do something that's about Muslim and Jewish musical interactions like in toto, right? Like that's impossible, and probably not desirable in certain ways. Like, I don't know, maybe it is desirable, but it's not something that like one person could do. But more, it's this question of like, what's the kind of problem? Like not in the sense of a problem, but in the intellectual sense of the problem, right? Like, and how does this come up? And like, what can, how can we see this? How can we see this? So like, what is it covering over? What is it actually also revealing, right? And so that's like this sort of thing. It's a kind of strategic question, right? That I think is really quite complex, and I don't think I've figured that out. In terms of your comment about the Franco-Arab, I really like that idea. You're totally right. In fact, there's some very early 20th century poems by Muslims who are combining French and colloquial Arabic in Western Algeria. So like you're absolutely right that like that's like and it's not just like a few words here and there. It's like actual kind of something like a little bit more like matruz, right? Like in the kind of Arabic and Hebrew tradition, right? Of mixing things. So that's like that's a really interesting idea. And it's also important, I think you mentioned Hilali, we tend to associate these kind of high profile singers with a very particular moment and a very particular sound or image of them. But of course, when you listen to like his early recordings, like he doesn't sound anything like what he sounds like a little later on. And he also is incredibly versatile in terms of genre, right? Like, and so it's, yeah, so I think that, that's a great suggestion. Both of those are great questions and lines to think through. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris, ever so much for the questions there. We have another question from Sumia Ahmed. So thank you for this talk. You touch on French colonial policy in Algeria, but for example, looking at the work of Ariella Azoulay, is there something more that can be said for the intentional othering that was the result of French policies?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I have a very, very complicated relationship with like the literature about actually, it's not, there's a certain kind of thread in the scholarly literature about North Africa, about colonial context more broadly, that I think makes an important intervention, but also introduces a problem, like a big challenge. So I think that there is a trend toward saying that certain kinds of social difference, right, between Jews and Muslims, or between Arabs and Berbers, or other groups, right, were kind of created by French colonial policy. And it's very much like a kind of parallel to work about caste in India, right, and British policy. It's an important argument, I'd say, but I think it can go way, way overboard, right? So it can make it sound like there was, that these were invented entirely by the French, right, or entirely by colonial policy, when it makes much more sense to say, well, there's a colonial situation, and that, of course, changes the ground on which social differentiation happens, right? And sometimes in many cases with very, very deep effects, right? So it's difficult to picture Algerian Jews leaving after independence if they had not been French citizens due to the Commune Decree of 1870, right? So those sorts of, there's some long-term processes that are, very, very much there. And of course, there's like kind of the political like pressures, right, that we can see kind of acting on people's language and practices and on their memory, right? And so like one of the ways that one of the really complicated pieces of this is how to think through the memory of Muslims and Jewish musicians from the perspective of contemporary France. That's like a huge headache, right? Like but it's a very interesting one, right? Like that's a huge job to think through. And it's very, very challenging. And so, but I would Sumaya, I would love to like, get your suggestions. And I mean, I think that the, and I think it's important not to minimize the kind of power of colonial politics. In a sense, we are still in colonial politics, right, today. But it's also one of these things where I'm also eager to make room for the very, very strong possibility that many of these patterns we're seeing, including patterns of differentiation, have a very, very, very long history that goes way, way back, right? In different ways. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Excuse me for not wanting to come on camera for Facebook.
That's fine.
But I don't think it's just about one decree or politics, but the logistical day-to-day effects of that. I mean, of becoming of a community. I mean, I think Azule does a really good job of describing, the logistics of how this happens with this. Where she uses the term of Algerian Jews being, basically deracinated and made to feel alienated even from their own ancestry. And part of this, becoming centered on French culture and geared towards that first. She says this, then they get to see the Muslims as others in a way, and then it's just a natural way for them to also then some Muslims become others within Algeria, and then obviously that carries into France, and then obviously then she says, and with Israel, then Muslim becomes the enemy. So she has a very interesting argument about, and so she says that Israel is then the existence of Israel then is a way that France is not held accountable for some way of how it even treated Algerian Jewish community, right? So she has very interesting things that I think, right, and you'd have to compare it to what things were like before, obviously, colonization. But I do think that there was some real logistics. I mean, you can't say that, all of a sudden, I think a lot of things were happening in the day-to-day lives of Algerian Jews and also Moroccan Jews that changed with colonialism that definitely feeds into this distinguishing between the communities, right? So
no, that's fascinating. I mean, and so I mean, again, I'm wary of saying that things were porous in the past and then hardened, because I think that's like that's a very tempting thing that modern.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that it took a different tone, a different severity, I think.
Yeah, I know, and that what you're saying makes sense to me, and it's also makes sense in terms of it's difficult, and sometimes it's very difficult to connect to Algeria when talking to Algerian Jews in France, and that's an interesting problem. Yeah, that sounds like it would be very helpful. Yeah, thank you, Samaya.
Thanks ever so much, Samia, for your question there. I'm going to jump in quickly, if I may, while other people come up with any other questions, if there are. I've got a kind of comment that could be a question, Jonathan. It's around the sort of theoretical framework that you're working with. There seem to be a lot of parallels here with the sort of discussion of boundaries, with some of the sort of working classical hybridity theory and post-colonial theory and so on. I'm thinking there's a lot of this in ethnomusicology in particular. It reminds me of an article that my PhD supervisor actually wrote about sort of the positioning of Jewish musicians in the Turkish context, particularly the founding of the Republic in the 1920s. And he employs Homi Bhabha's third space theory, where music becomes a supplementary discourse, as he uses it, to sort of unify cultural differences, but also perpetuate cultural difference at the same time. Sorry, unify cultural interests, but also perpetuate cultural differences. So I wonder whether there's any sort of crossover there potentially in classical hybridity theory and how you see that interacting with boundaries. So there's not much of a question, but if you take anything from that as you will.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting, and you know, I'll be honest, I know very little of like Homi Bhabha's like work directly. You know, it's and so I've encountered it, you know, largely through, you know, discussions of hybridity as they've kind of entered in anthropology. I mean, one of the problems with hybridity, just as I know it, kind of, you know, in my reading and my teaching, you know, one of the problems, and maybe you could direct me to something that would be helpful for thinking through this, is the temptation to the kind of essentializing danger in hybridity theory, right? Like in the sense of like saying that, well, they, you know, there's this thing here and then there's that thing here and then they kind of meet and then there's a kind of overlap, right? Because part of what I'm trying to get at here, and this, you know, kind of came more at the end of the talk, was to say, well, actually, like, it's not so much coming over from here and coming over from there and then kind of like meeting here, but rather it's like, it's this space right here that's actually like that is the space, that is like that is what this and that are, right? Like and so yeah, and so it's like that's just like a personal difficulty I've had with that. So yeah, but I would love to, you know, I would love to know more. That sounds like a really interesting train of thought.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate, absolutely. I mean, there's this kind of tendency towards, you know, what Jacqueline Lowe has called happy hybridity.
Right.
Like you say, the essentialization, the glorification of the two parent parts, so to speak, of
right.
hybrid. But I think a lot of, particularly Homi Bhabha's perspective, is more on the kind of the hyphen in between,
right,
that go on in that sort of in-between space. So it might, well, I don't know. I mean, I completely sympathize with your concerns.
Yeah.
But
right, and that hyphen, right, and yeah, and so that hyphen, right, I mean, there's a little bit of work on this about Arab Jewishness, right? Like right, the question of like the hyphen as separation, the hyphen as like joining, right? But it also seems to me that there's like there's other possibilities, right? Like in terms of, it's not so much just about joining, it's not so much just about separation, right? Like there might actually be like and that's, I guess, where the idea of affinity starts to get really interesting to me and attractive, right? And so yeah, and so I mean, this comes up a lot when I think about the question of Judeo-Arabic, which is something else I'm working on right now as kind of a side article I'm working on, where that is a very, very, like, that question of, you know, that question becomes very, very much at the fore in debates about, should we be talking about Judeo-Arabic, or is it simply a kind of Arabic? Is it just Arabic, right? And there, that hyphen strikes me as is very confusing, right? That you know, it kind of, it might be this idea of a sort of bringing together that is a kind of like that actually hides something much more unified, right? Than is obvious, you know, from the usage of that hyphen. Yeah.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you. I'll send you this article by my supervisor. It's John Morgan O'Connell, and see.
Yeah, it's great. I love this stuff. Yeah.
Anything that's useful in it. Yeah, your arguments, counter arguments, are very convincing. So thank you. So yeah, Sheila Mackenzie is added here. Perhaps we could think of it as an active passage rather than a space. I quite like that. Thank you, Sheila. So we do have time for one more question. If anybody has a last question or thought before we say goodbye. Vanessa, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in because what Chris was talking about, this going backwards to this early 20th century, made me think of going backwards like almost 1,000 years back to Kharjaz, you know, and this textual thing where they were mixing the vernacular with the Arabic. You know, I mean, this has been going on for over 1,000 years. And so just because of vernacular now is French, you know, before it used to be something else. But
Right.
maybe how do we kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? How do we, should we think of it as a full continuum?
Mhm.
And maybe, you know, maybe this contemporary material is actually a lot more related.
Mhm.
Is there a caesura in the middle
Mhm.
of that multilingual textuality or not? And do
Yeah.
we think of it as this continued tradition that shifts and changes just according to, you know, the political and linguistic context?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. That's very cool.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa.
Hmm.
So I think we will leave it there. We've gone well over 30
Yeah.
minutes of grilling, Jonathan. So I think I'll leave you in peace now.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks ever so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much. It's great to speak with you. In this is exactly what I was hoping for. Like, I really appreciate the comments and the questions. It gives me lots to work with, and I look forward to continue to communicate with many of you.
Absolutely. We look forward to seeing how the project develops as well. Very much so. Before everybody goes, I just wanted to flag up the next event that we have. That'll be a presentation by Rebecca Scales, who also focuses on the Algerian context, which will be on the 20th of May at 3 o'clock. We're yet to have an abstract in title, and that will be coming shortly. But if you can make it for that, then please do on the 20th of May at 3 o'clock. So thanks ever so much again to Jonathan and to all of you for coming. And yeah, see you all soon, hopefully. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.